live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be talking about a number of things. Obviously, Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariff announcements have set things into quite a tizzy, which we will talk about in the second hour of this presentation, I'm sure, at great length. But today I wanted to talk about the Kurds, specifically the Kurds in Syria and Turkey. These are two populations that have been of use to the United States and have also been very threatening to the countries that surround them. They've gone through incredible gyrations in their fortunes over the past number of years. Really, the 21st century has been frankly insane for the Kurds, and just the incredible rise in their fortunes and their incredible plummeting in their fortunes. And I thought it was worthwhile to do some review to talk about this incredibly important population for the Middle East in some detail, specifically because over the past month or so, a month and a half, it looks like we've seen great hope for both of these populations in Turkey and Syria. And I think it's worth it for me to lay out why I think these are tremendously hopeful developments. Because, frankly, the Kurds in Syria are in some terrible trouble. And also the Kurds in Turkey, that's been something we've been aware of for quite some time. Just wanted to talk about that. I did a ton of research on the Kurds, read like a 600-page textbook on the history, the modern history of Kurdistan. So I think I'm actually really well equipped to give this talk, and I'm pleased about that. First, before we get into it, if you're new here, it's important that you treat the chat civilly, that you be civil to each other in the chat. It's very important that you not attack each other. You can say anything you want about me, my ideas, my approaches to things. In fact, I encourage it. But you should not be saying anything genocidal about any population, and you should not be attacking anybody else in the chat or being disruptive to the chat. All right. Does not seem to be that many people here. Perhaps the Kurds are not as popular a topic as they should be, but I think that sort of starts things off on an appropriate scale for the Kurds, because the Kurds are always less popular than they should be, and despite providing great services to the United States and her allies, they just continually end up losing out. Is there... and just one brief question. Sure. I forgot to mention, please do be pleasant to everyone in the chat. If you are not, you'll be warned by Logo Cool Extreme. And if you do not listen to his warning, you will be thrown out of the chat. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. Listen to what he says. And also, if someone could let me know in the chat if I'm coming through okay, that would be good. I do not have the bandwidth to pay attention to the chat and to deliver this presentation. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, which will probably be a little briefer than normal. Try and get in under that 45-minute, maybe half an hour mark, because I know people want to talk about a lot of other things. All right. So, the Kurds. Who are the Kurds? The Kurds are a population of people that live in a particularly fraught set of countries. You may recall that both Syria and Iraq have been the focus of really brutal and intense U.S. attention over the past 2 decades that has been tremendously damaging to Syria and Iraq, and to a lesser extent to Iran and Turkey. This population of Kurds has been taken advantage of and promised great things at every instance of conflict in the region for the past 100 years. They most famously were promised a state by the victorious allies of World War One in 1920. Of course, nobody, nobody. Well, the victorious allies of World War One did get the agreement of the Ottoman state that was in the process of dying. Nobody asked the Turks, and the Turks under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk crushed that idea, kicked all the World War One allies out of Asia Minor, and Kurdistan did not end up happening. When Britain and France left Iraq and Syria, the Kurdish population in Iraq, Syria a little less so, which we might get to, used that as an opportunity to attempt to assert its national character. Interestingly, we're not going to be talking about the population in Iranian Kurdistan much, but because of World War II disasters and the occupation of Iran by the Soviet Union and Britain, it was actually the Iranian Kurds that set up the first sort of autonomous region for the Kurds, the Republic of Mahabad, in 1946, and just 1946. It lasted just about the year before it was crushed quite mercilessly. And that is, of course, another theme with the Kurds being crushed mercilessly by these countries. The most venerable of the Kurdish political parties, the Kurdish Democratic Party, was actually founded in Iran in 1946, but is most powerful in the semi-autonomous region of Iraq today. That is, I guess, the oldest of the three most powerful Kurdish parties, two of which are Iraqi and one of which is sort of Turkish Syrian, the PKK. Again, with the Iran-Iraq war, we saw Kurds being made very large promises by the United States and not getting them. Both the Iranian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds used that war to attempt to achieve some kinds of autonomy from their respective states. The Iraqi Kurds at incredible cost, the horrific genocidal campaign known as the Anfal campaign by Saddam Hussein in the late 1980s, and the chemical weapons induced execution of the town of Halabja. Some of the greatest crimes of the latter 20th century are part of the underpinnings of how Iraq came to be more autonomous. So the problem of the Kurds right now is that after two really heavy decades of United States destruction offering opportunities to the Kurds in Iraq, Syria, and to a much lesser extent Turkey, this seems to be coming to an end. The Iraqi, each of the most successful autonomous grouping still remains the Kurdish region in Iraq, which has its Kurdish regional government that attempted to declare independence in 2017 and was smacked down very heavily. Each of these Kurdish populations, the Kurdish populations famously do not work well with each other. Some groups do work well across national lines, but they are often working well across national lines to compete with their fellow Kurdish brothers in this country, in their own country, as much as they are to compete against these states. So you have these separate populations that over the past 20 years have, with the exception of Iran, it hasn't been a great, or perhaps it has been a great 20 years for the Iranian Kurds because they haven't gotten their hopes massively inflated and then crushed, because that has happened to the Kurds to different extents of Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. The Kurdish, so what's happening this year, specifically since the fall of Assad, is that the underpinnings of Kurdish independence struggles that have kept autonomous dreams going on for decades have been all crushed over the past 5 years, specifically the fall of the Assad regime. is sort of a last crushing of those aspirations. If you look to the Kurds of Iraq, it was interesting learning their history. They've been sort of fighting for autonomy and achieved some degree of autonomy in some of their mountain fastnesses, throughout the history of Iraqi independence. But in 1992, they truly established, sort of full autonomy. Of course, in 2003, that autonomy was extended with the fall of Saddam Hussein and the rest of Iraq being an absolute basket case of Sunni-Shia conflict. And then again, in 2014, the rampaging success of the Islamic State allowed the Kurds to take even more power. So traditionally, the Iraqi autonomy is tremendously reliant on Iraqi Kurdish autonomy is tremendously reliant on the Iraqi government looking weak and sort of beaten up. So 1992, Saddam loses the Gulf War, or that was a little bit earlier, but that's sort of when the autonomy was established. 2003, Saddam Hussein and Iraq is crushed, and 2014, the Islamic State comes in. All of this served to make Iraq look more autonomous and more powerful, and unfortunately, it made Iraqi Kurdistan acquire some hubris that eventually led to it being crushed. And that happened in 2017. One of the side effects of the Islamic State fight was that the Iraqi military was built up much more seriously and developed a lot of really nasty experience fighting that it hadn't really had since de-Baathification, since the U.S. coalition's destruction of Saddam Hussein's army during our initial occupation. So the Islamic State basically almost destroyed the Iraqi government, but ended up making the Iraqi government, the central Iraqi government, and the central Iraqi military much more powerful. So in 2017, the Iraqi Kurds, who had taken Kirkuk, a very wealthy city that had been a source of dispute for decades, decided they would push their luck and declare independence, and the now much more powerful Iraqi government came in and crushed them, essentially. We saw this dynamic play out multiple times in recent decades with the Kurds in Turkey. The worst decade of conflict between Turkey and Turkey's Kurds is reckoned to be the 1990s. That was because there were massive Kurdish refugee inflows because of the Gulf War. Kurdish autonomy was very inspiring to that group. And what the PKK, this is the sort of a Kurdish Syrian group that has fought against the Turkish government for quite some time, had was almost complete support of the Syrian government. The PKK was allowed to sort of settle. I mean, Syria, as you might be able to tell from this map, is less threatened by Kurdish populations than any of the other groups. There are just vastly fewer Kurds there, and Syria was happy to use the PKK and Kurdish resistance against their Cold War enemies. That ended in 1998, essentially because Turkey, a much more wealthy country, and the Syrians, without the Soviet Union backing them up any longer, in 1998, the Turks simply went to the border and said, if you keep hosting the PKK, we're just invading. And Syria didn't really have a counterpoint to that. So at that point, the Kurdish insurgency that had been raging had seemed somewhat successful in the 1990s, rather swiftly petered out. Abdallah Öcalan, who'd been sitting happily in Syria, had to leave the country, sort of ran around the world for a year or two before Turkish commandos captured him in Kenya, of all places. And Abdallah Öcalan, the sort of head of the PKK, has been in jail in Turkey ever since. So what happened was, Öcalan being in jail, early 1990s, a more religious party came to power in Turkey, and that religious party made the argument, whether it was sincere or not, that actually the real problem between Turks and Kurds in the Republic of Turkey since the 1920s was this like rampaging secularism, and if Turkey had a government that was a little more sympathetic to religion, then actually maybe Kurds and Turks could live together better. And there's some strength to that argument. There's a lot of strength to the fact that in the aughts, Syria just wasn't providing a home base for the PKK anymore. And actually, surprisingly, the Turks were forming a much stronger friendship with the leaders of the autonomous Kurdish region in Iraq because they had such use for Iraqi oil. So it was a combination of, maybe a more Islamic government is more conducive to peace. No longer having this quite as rabid idea of Turkish nationality, but also the PKK was kind of shut off from support in Syria, to some extent support in Iraq, though that was always sort of ongoing and a dynamic. There are multiple parties in Iraqi Kurdistan with differing attitudes towards the PKK. And then the United States decided to destroy Assad in 2011. And this sort of reignited both, certainly the idea of Syrian autonomy as Kurdish autonomy in Syria, which was kind of new, and in Turkey itself. The Turkish government had been limping along with the peace process for quite some time, and it was sort of completely derailed in 2015. For some Turkish electoral reasons. This will become a theme, and the in 2015, and the PKK again. This is something that we've seen was inspired by the fact that not only did Iraqi Kurdistan have an autonomous government, but now Syria had an autonomous government. So the PKK decided it would be a good idea to declare autonomy in a bunch of Turkish cities in the east of Turkey, and that led to pretty horrific destruction. So I think we've got in Iraq, in Turkey, and not as much, but certainly in Syria as well, Kurdish populations that really got over their skis and asked for too much. And in 2014, 2015, it looked like, oh, wow, especially with the Syria's Kurds with their full backing from the United States to fight the Islamic State, it kind of looked like these long cherished dreams of Kurdish independence, or at least Kurdish autonomy, would be strengthened or what have you. That was crushed in Turkey rather quickly. Diyarbakir, I was lucky enough to visit Diyarbakir in 2011 and tour the historic ancient downtown of Diyarbakir, which was apparently entirely destroyed in fighting between the Turkish government and the PKK in 2015 through 2017. The PKK was crushed militarily, much worse than that. The Kurdish parties, this is an established dynamic. I've been associated with Turkey, gosh, I don't know, like 12 years or so, and they're on at least their third Kurdish party. Starting in the 1990s, I believe, or actually maybe even going back to Özal in the 80s, there was some like, okay, I guess there can be a peaceful Kurdish party, maybe, but then, this party would get established, and then eventually all of those politicians would end up in jail and the party would end up getting banned. So we're easily on the sixth or seventh attempt at a peaceful Kurdish party in Turkish politics. So in 2015 through 2017, it's hard for me to be that sad that PKK's attempt to establish violent independence in Turkish towns was crushed. But it is quite sad that Selahattin Demirtas, HTB and his HDP party all ended up in jail, and sort of the very promising peaceful participation of Kurdish parties in the Turkish system was also crushed in 2015, 2017. Iraqi Kurdish pretensions to independence were crushed conclusively in 2017. The autonomy still exists in Iraq, but they, like everybody else who relies on petroleum sales, over the past decade have been sort of economically crushed and now militarily crushed in 2017. So I don't think anybody expects any great strides towards autonomy or independence from the Iraqi Kurds any longer. And in December of 2024, the aspirations for the Syria, Rojava, Syria's Kurds were crushed like entirely, in really disturbing ways. Basically, the interesting thing about the Kurdish participation in fighting in the Syrian civil war is that they'd never really been opposed to Assad. You can absolutely find instances, especially after U.S. support really stepped up for the Kurds, of some clashes between Assad forces and Kurd forces. But I had assumed that sort of the natural endpoint for the Syrian Kurdish autonomous experiment was making some kind of peace with Assad, because the Kurds of Syria, of Syria's autonomous region, had spent most of their time fighting jihadists, now, of course, there's wide varieties of jihadists. It's not clear to me that HTS, the faction that now rules Syria, has any special animus towards the Kurds. However, the Syrian National Army, which is a component of the HTS government of Syria, has basically just been Turkey's sort of genocide squad towards the Kurds. That's most of the fighting that faction of jihadists did during this civil war. So basically, where I was with the Kurds, I'd always been pretty pissed off that the United States had chosen to put the Kurds in this position. Obviously, our NATO member, Turkey, with the second biggest military in Europe, just the second biggest military in NATO, so only second only to the United States, with its tremendously strategically important position and use in conflict with Russia. We were always going to go with those guys, so I thought it was particularly atrocious the way that U.S. government figures like Brett McGurk had continued to sort of lead the Kurds down a path of not just animosity towards the Turkish government, but also towards the Syrian government. Always thought that was a really bad thing. But when the Assad government fell and the jihadists that the Kurds had been fighting for 10 years came to full power in Syria, I got terrified. I got really, really worried for the Kurds, which brings us to where I wanted to, what I wanted to talk about, the recent developments that I wanted to talk about today. It is tremendously positive that there appears to be a peace process in both Syria and Turkey at this point. Do I have high hopes for this peace process? No. I know you'd be insane to have high hopes for this peace process. But it needs to the extent that people can be excited about it and try to encourage it, we need to be excited about it and try to encourage it. We're actually in I guess it's not so positive from the Kurdish perspective, but it is positive from the perspective of the potential for peace, which is that Turkey has won here. Turkey has won on every metric. Turkey has beaten the PKK repeatedly in the late 1990s, and then again in 2015, repeatedly militarily, but now has essentially, thanks to Israel and Israel's continued bombing of the new Syrian government has no choice but to double down further on a sort of client relationship with Turkey. So, I mean, in some, it overstates it to say that the Ottoman Empire is back. And Turkey now shares a border with Israel. That overstates it, but it doesn't overstate it a ton. Erdogan's decade-long project to remove Assad and replace it with fellow Sunni adherents looked like a failure for the longest time until it succeeded. And it has succeeded. And I think Turkey, across the conservative Turkish political spectrum, I think there's an acknowledgement that they don't actually need to fight the Kurds anymore. The Kurds have been so comprehensively beaten that peace is really possible, and it does seem like the Turkish government is amenable to that and might be willing to go forward with that for a variety of self-interested and selfish reasons, and it might help them crush other democratic elements in the Turkish scene, and frankly, that's fine because we're not talking about the survival of rights or democracy in Turkey, which is very important, of course. We're talking about like the physical survival of the Kurds in Turkey. When I say that the Syrian National Army, that this is now a component, not the dominant component, but a serious component of Syria's new government, like they really were genocidal in their approach to the Kurds. So the threat is very, very real to the existence of Kurds in Syria. Not so much Kurds in Turkey. And it is such a positive development that there are peace processes in both places. A concerning element, because I think if you look at these in isolation, it's possible to be more excited about the peace process in Syria than it's funny. As I go Turkey, it's hard to resist going Syria. It's more possible to be excited about the peace process in Syria than in Turkey, but the Syria peace process is entirely dependent on the Turkey peace process, and we saw how that developed. What's been happening, this push by the Turkish government has been developing since at least October of 2024. Even before Assad had fallen, this was something the Turkish government was interested in. This was signified by Devlet Bahçeli, who I believe is not technically in the AK party still. He is the leader of the MHP, the hyper-nationalist party that refused to enter into a coalition with the Kurds in 2015. One of the great missed opportunities in Turkish democracy was that Erdogan lost a parliamentary election back in 2015, but this guy, Devlet Bahçeli's Nationalist Party, which at that point was more opposed to Erdogan's party, refused to enter into a coalition with the Kurdish party. Erdogan was able to restart antagonism with the Kurds, get the support of the MHP in a new election, and is still in power a decade later. So it is very significant that Devlet Bahçeli, who is in coalition with Erdogan, was the guy making outreach to the 10th iteration of a peaceful Kurdish party, making overtures to the Kurds more broadly. It was very hopeful moves in October, which was unfortunately followed up directly by an attack that was, I believe, attributed not to the PKK directly, but to a different splinter Kurdish group. But the Turkish government persisted because they saw a benefit in this. And they continued to persist after the absolute regional thunderclap of the fall of the Assad regime in December of 2024. And actually, I'd say perhaps their urge towards a peace process was accelerated by the fact that Turkey had just won so completely, so dominantly. The reason that Rojava, the Syrian Kurdish territory, had been able to exist and have autonomy was because the Assad regime was kind of ambivalent to it and was happier to have them doing their thing than the jihadists that posed a more serious threat to Assad as a religious minority in a 70% Sunni Islamic state. Now the jihadists are in charge of the country, and those jihadists were heavily sponsored by Turkey throughout this conflict. So instead of being frenemies with the Syrian government while fighting the Turkish government, the choice of the Kurds in Syria in this autonomous region is to fight the Syrian government and the Turkish government and the nasty jihadist militias all allied to each other. So the Syrian Kurds really have no choice. But what's interesting is that it's still completely subsidiary because despite the U.S. government's protestations, the Rojava SDF, YPJ, whatever, all those groups are deeply affiliated with the PKK. which the Turkish government has been very outraged about, and the United States has been essentially lying about for 5-10 years now. The Because of that reliance on the PKK, there wasn't really much scope for peace between Syria's Kurds and the Syrian government without some peaceful moves in Turkey. And we got those. February 27th, Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, who's been in a Turkish jail for 26 years now, made an announcement that the PKK should lay down their arms, sort of unilateral ceasefire by the PKK. Tremendously hopeful development. It's funny, we had commentary from the SDF. These are sort of one of the acronyms that describes the Syrian Kurds, that, oh, well, that's nice, but this doesn't mean much to us. Literally 2 weeks later, the head of the SDF, Mazlum Abdi, is meeting with Ahmed al-Shara, the guy who used to be known as Jolani, the leader of Syria, and we've got like real moves towards a peace process. Is anything settled in either of these conflicts in Turkey or Syria? Absolutely not. These things are not settled in any respects. Most recent news is Erdogan's getting testy and is making demands. The PKK needs to be disarming more quickly, and it needs to be settled. Even though, of course, Turkey can be testy and make demands because they've won on every front. We've got unilateral ceasefire from the PKK. There's apparently some kind of PKK Congress coming up where they decide whether they should dissolve. What's interesting, Öcalan, despite being in a Turkish jail for 26 years and vastly changing his philosophy and approach to this conflict, he apparently is no longer interested in independence. He believes, which I think you can actually make a case for, that the moves of the Turkish government over the past 20 years to be more accepting of Kurdish nationality, Kurdish language, Kurdish education, Kurdish political parties, Kurdish TV channels, all things which were heavily banned and murdered over by the Turkish government in the 1990s. Öcalan sort of argues that this has ended the necessity for independence. This is also a really sensible economic move. Turkey is a country that is moving from being a developing country to a developed country. There's the biggest and wealthiest Kurdish city is definitely Istanbul, a Turkish city far in the east. It's one of the biggest. It's the biggest city in the region. But there's a lot of questions here. To what degree are the current PKK fighters going to fully observe this ceasefire, continue this ceasefire? Obey Turkish government demands to disband? We've been here before, but it's good to be here again. And it would be nice if we could stay here. Unfortunately, it seems pretty clear. No, it's not. It's not. I don't think it's a question that the Turkish government hasn't come out and said this directly. It's quite clear that this Kurdish opening, the AK Party, Erdogan and his folks, saw this as an opportunity to crush some other folks, saw this as an opportunity to crush the main opposition party in Turkey. This has really been a dynamic for the past 20 years of Erdogan governance. He wants to get more friendly with the Kurds so he can get their votes against the old secular elite in Istanbul, and that's, of course, exactly an aspect of what he's doing right now. Getting a little more friendly with the Kurds, hoping to win some more Kurdish votes, while crushing the secular opposition in a really disheartening way. I think perhaps it's a real fall down for Turkish democracy. This particular class of dissident against the Erdogan regime had not been attacked with this vigor yet. This sort of affluent, the sorts of people I was friends with when I lived in Istanbul at the beginning of the last decade for about 6 years. Back in the 20-teens. It's longer and longer ago, 2011 to 2016. So sort of like the affluent Western-facing opposition party that finally, since 2019, has been making real headway, winning the mayorship of I think most of the big Turkish cities away from Erdogan's AK party. Erdogan himself went from being mayor of Istanbul to being prime minister of the country. That may seem like a big jump, but then you realize that Istanbul is at least a fifth of the population of the country, and it seems like less of a jump. So February 27th, we had this tremendous reach out by Öcalan, and on March 19th, the Erdogan government arrested the opposition mayor of Istanbul. I think protests are still ongoing 2 or 3 weeks later. Speaking as someone who participated in very heavily in anti-Erdogan protests in 2013, I do not have a great deal of hope for the success of that. And I think, as was the case with the Gezi protests back in 2013, this sort of stepped up street actions, stepped up levels of violence and crushing of democracy does not bode well for this peace process. However, the Syrian issue does seem to be largely settled. And it was the ongoing horrors of the Syrian civil war that in part derailed the peace process back in 2015. So perhaps there's still hope for the Turkish peace process, but there's less. The Syrian peace process, the Kurds literally have no other choice. So that yields a little bit more hope. Who knows how sincere Ahmed al-Shara is in whatever commitments he makes for the Syrian government. Who knows to what extent Ahmed al-Shara, the head of the Syrian government, has the capability of carrying out positive deals he might have made with the Kurds. Again, it's unclear what degree of power the quite nasty and quite virulently anti-Kurdish Syrian National Army, what degree of power it has. The Syrian National Army is the section of the Syrian government that is being blamed for the quite nasty pogroms that were carried out against the Alawite population in Syria right before this peace deal between the SDF and Ahmed al-Shara. It was not a detailed deal of any sort between the Syrian government and Syria's Kurds. It's sort of an agreement to make an agreement. Apparently, it is in this month, April, when representatives from the Syria's Kurds and the Syrian government are going to sit down and truly hash out what's going to happen to the territory the Kurds control, the oil the Kurds control, the tens of thousands of Islamic State prisoners that the Kurds control. It's not clear at all that these issues are at all resolved, but I think the main message I want to emphasize here is that this is hope that the Kurds need to grasp onto as hard as they possibly can, because they're screwed. There was no help coming from the Biden administration, and there's certainly no help coming from the Trump administration. Europe couldn't care less. They desperately need Turkey and its president Erdogan to maintain conflict against Ukraine. This was true. Making conflict against Russia. This was true under the Biden administration that was much more friendly to Europe. This is even more true under the Trump administration that is more antagonistic to Europe. So there's like a desperate need from the Europeans, a complete lack of give a crap from the Americans, as to Turkey's actions. So the Kurds are like super screwed here. So I think that it is very much in the interests of the Kurds to make these peace deals work, and from a position of great weakness. So it's not yet a happy story for the Kurds, but honestly, these two peace processes starting in Turkey in late February, and in Syria on March 10th, are the most hopeful things that have happened to the Kurds, certainly since December, but arguably since 2017 or thereabouts. That is the presentation I wanted to deliver. Here's one last look at that Kurdistan map. It's an interesting problem, but honestly, I thought that this was going to be another great source, as the Kurds have been repeatedly, another great source of horror and genocide, and I have some hopes that may not be the case. I think that actually we should work harder to make Syria more powerful, so that Jolani, or Ahmad al-Shara, he's known by two names, can actually have the strength necessary to crush the Syrian National Army and actually establish peace and security across Syria. I think that that's actually the thing that we could do the most in the United States, and we can do that very easily by withdrawing U.S. troops and by lifting sanctions on Syria. So yeah, that's what I have to say about the Kurds. Happy that we've got 30 odd people here. It's interesting learning. If I do a live chat on Israel or some Trump absurdity or Ukraine, I'll get 50 to 100 people. If I talk about the Kurds and their plight, I get 35, 40 people. And I am grateful for the 35 of you that have showed up. The real heads, the folks who actually care about what's actually happening in geopolitics rather than the scary headlines. Do we have any questions on the Kurds or really anything else? I've got an hour and 17 minutes here. I'll take questions off of TikTok over here, and I'll take questions off of YouTube over here. And I'm happy to hear a bunch from anybody. Questions. Just note that the PKK is not Syrian Kurds. They're Iranian and Turkish Kurds who made a huge problems in Syria. Caused populations in some of that regions to favor ISIS over the ones who cleansed them from their cities, etc. I think that the consensus House of Wisdom actually is that the SDF, especially in the context of the Syrian National Army or the Islamic State, is that the SDF has been, or the Assad regime or the Turkish government, out of all of those actors, the SDF, not out of any special virtue, but because they kind of had to be, were the nicest to minority groups. Are there examples of them acting in horrific ways to Arab populations that they controlled? Absolutely. But if you compare them to every other actor in the region, they're not that bad. Do I think that the SDF should retain the power that it has over Arab areas? Absolutely not. Like, the whole point of that was to fight against the Assad regime, or rather to defend Arab populations from the Assad regime and from the Islamic State. Ahmad al-Shara seems to me to be legitimately interested in transcending the jihadi nut jobs that did help to bring him to power. And I think that the rationale for Kurds controlling Arab areas in Syria is gone now. So yeah, I'm actually quite sympathetic to that. I also really like the idea of the Syrian government taking control over all of these ISIS prisoners. These are ISIS prisoners, but they're also like ISIS families, like women and children growing up for like a decade now in a prison camp. And will the new Syrian government essentially set all these people free? I mean, probably. And that doesn't necessarily bother me much, but I'm happy for them to be the Syrian government's problems, not the U.S. and the Kurdish financial burdens. Do I think that foreign fighters should be in the Syrian government? I don't like that so much. I don't think people should be quite as adamantly opposed to it as the Turkish and American governments seem to be, but obviously that's not something I don't like. But should foreign fighters be able to live in this jihadi paradise that they helped create? Yes, I should think so. I think it's actually a great place to drop off a lot of these completely unprocessed, never going to be prosecuted prisoners. So yeah, will Iran get back in Syria? This is up to the Israelis, and the answer seems to be that the Israelis are being extreme enough and brutal enough to Syria that the Syrian government is probably going to be willing to work with anybody. We kind of probably are in a magic moment or magic decade for Israel when there is so much bad blood between Hezbollah, the main fighting force in Lebanon against Israeli occupation, and the current Syrian government, because of course Hezbollah worked really hard to keep Assad in power, fighting against the current Syrian government. So for a decade or so, I think there'll be enough bad blood, but Syria is being so aggressive and so pointlessly violent against both Lebanon, which has acted to push Hezbollah out of power to some extent, and against the new Syrian government, which, yeah, obviously it's led by a guy whose name was nom de guerre was Jolani, a guy who wants to take the Golan Heights back from Israel. But this Syrian government has not acted against Israel in any way, and the Israeli government has carried out something like 700 military attacks against the new Syrian government, blowing up airports, airplanes, destroyed the entire Syrian navy, all kinds of really nasty stuff that is very likely to make the Syrian government look more friendlier towards both Iran and Hezbollah. That, however, is a sort of over time thing, and it's an open question. It's I think, a greater burden than the Syrian government's animosity to Iran and Hezbollah is, what does Turkey think? Is Turkey interested in competition with Iran this year or cooperation with Iran this year? Turkey and Iran are, of course, historic, massive enemies in this region. The sort of Kurdish border here, you'll note that the border between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey is all a little, especially, I guess, it all looks like it was drawn by European imperialists in the early 20th century, those sort of very straight lines or kind of squiggly lines. And then you look at the border between Turkey and Iran, and Iraq and Iran, and that's a very, very squiggly border that actually has to do with long-standing features, and I'm sure it's not all exactly the same, but a lot of that border goes back to conflicts between the Ottoman and the Safavid empires, going back to the 1500s. I mean, that's a real long-standing border there. So Turkish and Iranian or Turkish-Persian competition is one of the dominating factors of the region. So I guess, will Iran be able to get back into Syria? Depends entirely upon the degree to which Turkey wants that to happen. The first big winner from Israeli attacks on Syria is Turkey, for sure. When Ahmed al-Shara, I guess it's the president, right? Or is he interim president? What is he doing? Or is it the prime minister? I can't remember. Ahmed al-Shara, when he was in Idlib, was completely dependent on Turkey. And even, if he'd just managed to take Aleppo in December of last year, he would have remained entirely dependent on Turkey. But when he, to the shock of everybody, probably even Ahmed al-Shara, took the entire country in December of 2024, he was very likely to want to, assert some independence from Turkey. Would have wanted to say, like, okay, great, thank you so much, you're our great special friends, but we are our own country. And that is an established dynamic, people trying to distance themselves from their biggest patrons because, they have self-respect and want sovereignty and want to do their own thing and not be completely dependent on one outside actor. But because of the shocking pace, scale, and duration of Israel's attacks on this new Syrian government that has done nothing to attack Israel, Turkey, the Syrian government has no choice other than Turkey. If it just wants to stop being bombed by Israel, it needs Turkish diplomatic support, intimidation support. It needs Turkish deterrence. So at some point, the Syrian government would like some independence from Turkey, but it's not happening while Israel continues to bomb at this level. So I think the question of how much is Iran going to make it back into Syria is very dependent on what the Turks want at this point. All right. Azar Bestoun says, as a Kurd, I'm actually glad that we aren't in the headlines as much. That's probably for the better. Local Extreme says, my unwoke boomer take is that I'm still calling it Turkey and calling him Jolani, referring to Ahmad al-Shara, the president of Syria. I'm a big believer in calling places what they want to be called. I think I was called out for continuing to use Turkey for too long, which I think is fair. I lived in Turkey. I love Turkey, but the Turks want it to be Turkey, so it's Turkey. As far as I'm asking a really key question that I am not at all well versed in, I'm spending too much time thinking about the Kurds instead of French politics. But as far as I'm asked, what are your thoughts on Le Pen being banned from running? Did France do an Erdogan, or is it law is law? Is there some double standards happening here? I would say there are absolutely double standards happening here. And obviously, it would be way too simple-minded to say that Le Pen is being attacked because Mahmoud Khalil is being attacked in the United States. But I do think it is part of a trend that the United States is setting, which is that the respect for democracy is diminishing. The respect for personal rights is diminishing across the Western world. And, that's a really interesting question. Would France have arrested Le Pen if Biden was president? That's a really interesting question. And it's not like, ooh, they're more concerned about Le Pen and right-wing because of Trump. No, it's like they know that Trump doesn't give a shit and probably isn't going to complain much. Maybe, I haven't seen, has Trump, issued some kind of communique? I know that a lot of right-wingers in the United States are pretty pissed off about this. But I wouldn't expect it to be like a huge issue. So for those who may not know, Marine Le Pen, the sort of perennial almost winner of presidential races in France, very right-wing for my entire adult life. First her father and then Marine Le Pen. It's, oh no, the Le Pen, I think she's on, this is the second or third party for the Le Pen family's right-wing challenges to French government. But I remember it was very scary when they got 17%. And I don't know, in the last election, was it in the 30s or the 40s or something along those lines? So does it look really shady for France to arrest their right-wing dissident party leader? It sure effing does. Is there a real legal basis for it? Yeah, maybe. I can't speak to the rigidity of French campaign finance laws, but I think that with any legal process, perhaps less so in civil law countries like France, there's just a lot of leeway, as we're seeing now, the pardoning of Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City. But there's a lot of choices made by prosecutors, and it's entirely possible that in a different era, the prosecutors in France would be like, this just looks too suspect. Maybe we'll let her slide. Maybe we'll give her a fine. Maybe we will the choice to actually incarcerate her for like a 5-year-old campaign finance thing. That looks very Erdogan to me. Maybe there's a better case to be made for this that I haven't researched, but yeah, no, it's I think it's kind of both. Like, there's definitely double standards here. I don't doubt that there's something you can trigger somebody on. It could very well be the law, but yeah, Erdogan is famous for prosecuting people, or the people around him, the Gulenists, when they used to support him. Were famous for going after political opponents for minor details and screw-ups, or exaggerated versions of tax bills or that sort of thing. So yeah, it looks pretty Erdogan. I don't know that it is pretty Erdogan, but I do think there is a broader argument that we're seeing some serious democratic backsliding in Europe. This example, I'm not too familiar with the details. I've looked enough at the Romanian example that none of the excuses for it are at all persuasive to me. This is an election in Romania where a guy who was maybe, definitely more right wing and maybe Russia curious did well on TikTok and won an election. So the Romanian government were like, no, that election didn't count. That's insane to me. And I think you can point to a lot of examples of which now this arrest of Le Pen is one of the European political class choosing to change the rules in their favor now that sort of the old sort of liberal elite is fading. And that's not good, even though I would vastly prefer that France be run by Macron than be run by Le Pen. It is still not a good thing, not an acceptable thing in my mind, that political party heads in France be arrested for political reasons, if that is in fact what happened here. It sort of looks that way. M. Mahdi Bikhet says, as an Iranian, I'm just happy to get out from the Syrian conflict. Yeah, and I think that's a good thing. I think that Iran has really been kind of liberated, and if we do, which is possible, I'm not saying it's likely, if we really do have people in the Trump administration who are able to stop this rush to war with Iran that we're certainly seeing right now, I think one of their best cases would be that, one of the big scary things was Iran's support of this Shia crescent or whatnot. Well, it's gone now. There is actually a dramatically less threatening of Israel going on, dramatically less control of Lebanese, certainly Syrian politics by Iran now. Why is it so important that we go to war over a country that's now dramatically less of a threat? And Madi says, how does it feel to see idiot Twitch streamers have bigger audiences than you? No disrespect intended. It doesn't feel great. I do feel like I present worthwhile information and a good product or whatever. And I think it continues to be kind of sad that I don't have as much of an audience as I would like to. But I'm tremendously grateful for the folks that show up here. I'm able to talk about things that I care deeply about, and there are 45 people here right now who are willing to listen, and I'm tremendously grateful for that. I think that I don't want to be snotty or whatnot, but I do think that I have managed to attract a better class of viewer, folks who actually care deeply about these issues and actually know things about these issues, and that's also tremendous privilege. I'm sort of definitely wrestling at this point with the realization that this has not been a financially successful way to spend 10 years. And especially with what Trump is doing to the stock market, I may have to, recalculate and do different things. But I will always be incredibly grateful that the folks have been able to, see the More Freedom Foundation as a place to have intelligent discussions about things. And I do think that a lot of, I'm reading more and more, I guess, in the Elon Musk context, about how people get captured by their audience. And perhaps if I had a much bigger audience, I would be pressured by that audience to say and do things that I don't believe. And that has never been the case. And I don't think it's ever been the case. I think part of the thing about audience capture is you don't necessarily notice it happening. But if I were to be captured by my audience, this is a great audience to be captured by, and I'm tremendously grateful for it. Geez, Joseph Parent, we're going detailed here. What do you think will happen with Abkhazia and South Ossetia with the weakening of Russian power worldwide? I've been told Georgia is too important for Russia to let go because of Caucasian reach. I'll be honest, Joseph, I don't know enough about the details of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These are famously the breakaway regions of Georgia, which is the Caucasus Mountain country right below Russia, neighbor of Armenia and Azerbaijan, in between Iran, Turkey, and Russia. Kind of a fraught place to be. Abkhazia and South Ossetia are sort of famous. Frozen conflicts. Actually, geez, I guess we're running. Well, no, I guess you've still got Abkhazia, South Ossetia, the four great post-Soviet frozen conflicts for decades were Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria in Moldova, and Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia. Rather in Azerbaijan. It's definitely in Azerbaijan, and the Azeris have proved that. That conflict has been unfrozen. And I think actually the unfreezing and the complete ethnic cleansing of Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh, which we saw back in, was that 2022? Or 2023? No, it was earlier in 2023, I think. Was a resolution of that frozen conflict because Russia had gotten so much weaker. I don't know, and why the Syria issue that Russia maintained and the Nagorno-Karabakh issue that Russia maintained both sort of fell apart or unraveled was because the fundamentals of Armenia's power and the Assad regime's power had fundamentally changed since those frozen conflicts were set up. For the Assad regime, it was the U.S. sanctions that utterly destroyed his economy, made it impossible for him to rebuild after what I think most see as his victory in the Syrian civil war in 2016-2017. And for Armenia, it was, they were by far the more powerful and more wealthy country in the 1990s when they took all that Azeri territory. Because of support from their diaspora. But Azerbaijan became a sort of petroleum, oil, and gas titan in those 30 years. And it was really just Russia that was keeping Nagorno-Karabakh as a frozen conflict. So I don't really know what the balance is between the Georgian government and Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I know that there are real populations, certainly in Abkhazia. I don't know the details of South Ossetia, or really Abkhazia either. There are populations that are very serious within those territories about maintaining their autonomy. If Georgia decided to try its luck again, as it did in 2008, certainly Russia would have difficulty well, I'm not sure, honestly, because I think the Russian military machine is a lot more powerful and effective because of the Ukraine war than it was back in 2008. I don't know. But also, my understanding is that the Georgian government is currently held by still Georgian Dream that is pretty Russia curious still. So I don't know. Essentially, Joseph Parent, this is a really long way of me saying I don't know enough about the current status of Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. So I don't know. But my hunch is that it's probably not as likely to collapse as the Assad regime or Nagorno-Karabakh were, because I don't know that the dynamics between Georgia and South Ossetia have changed as much as U.S. sanctions changed Assad's prospects or the rise of Azerbaijan as a oil and gas superpower over the past really 30 years were. So, yeah. Malta says there were over 200 people getting banned from running for office in France in the last year for criminal charges. This is the case, talking about Le Pen, the case was running for years. Letting her run would be the double standard. Well, perhaps that's the case. Crow Guy says, as an Iraqi Shia, I'm so tired of Iran and its regional allies dragging us Shias into wars we have nothing to do with. Sounds like a good instinct to me, Crow Guy. Um, Malta says criminals are criminals, even if they're fascists. Um, Shodonks asks, what stops unification in the Red Sea after the hegemon recedes from the region? Unification in the Red Sea? What, like Yemen and Saudi Arabia? Well, first off, I don't know that the hegemon's going to recede from the region. I am concerned and have talked about my concerns about in the Yemen series of what happens when Saudi Arabia collapses, and are the Houthis going to try for the Hijaz again? Going to try for Mecca and Medina? That seems a little science fiction. That seems a little crazy, but the way things can shift if Saudi Arabia falls apart, I think people should be thinking a little bit harder about that. I think, I don't know if Fadel still shows up for these things, but he probably would disagree with me on this. But I believe that a lot of this talk, and the Islamic State tried to implement it, of, all these borders were drawn by Europeans 100 years ago, and they're BS, and it doesn't really match the tribes or the inclinations of the people on the ground. And I think that was absolutely the case 100 years ago. I think that the dream of pan-Arab unity was really enticing in the 1950s and the 1960s. But now we have countries that have evolved for 50 years. And when Saudi Arabia was set up in the 1920s, there were like 2 million people there, or something along those lines. Like, it was not there just weren't many people there, like, at all. But Saudi Arabia has become, in the 100 years since, in the century since, has become a country of over 40 million people, high literacy rates. People became literate people as Saudi Arabians, and I think that's incredibly important and should not be underemphasized. I mean, that's the core of why the Vietnamese were able to throw out the French and then the Americans. That's the core of why the Iraqis were able to throw out the Americans. And those national ideas, and Iraq is one of the most artificial of those countries. I mean, it was basically a country built around British oil appetites. And stupid people like Joe Biden and maybe me were very interested in the idea of, like, oh man, we just broke Iraq so much, we got to just split it up. And despite having a horrific sectarian civil war, there was a majority of Iraqis, Shia, Sunni, and Kurd, less so Kurd, as we've just discussed, but also Kurd, who were not interested in breaking up Iraq. So yeah, like this idea that, once the United States steps back, are we going to get like a pan-Arab unity? Like, I mean, Nasser in Syria tried that in the late 1950s, 58 to 61, Syria and Egypt were unified. And it didn't work then. After like a decade and a half of independence for those countries, I really don't think it would work 75 years later. But maybe I'm wrong. So was that your question? What stops unification in the Red Sea? Or were you more thinking of the or you were more thinking of the Horn of Africa, Shodanks? Anyway, thank you, Shodanks, for the super chat. I'm definitely more likely to answer questions if I get super chats. And Shodanks says cultural goals are better than financial goals, and I'm grateful to hear that. But yeah, at some point, financial goals will probably have to intercede. Especially if Donald Trump keeps tanking the U.S. stock market. Logo Cruel Stream says, More Freedom Foundation, do you think it was a good idea to make a stream on the Kurds just as Trump tossed the U.S. economy into a dumpster? Loga is not just my social media manager, but is here to tell me often that I should do things that are more popular. And yes, a stream on the Kurds, perhaps not the most popular thing to do. And yes, I'm surprised there have been fewer questions on that. Donald Trump did just throw the world economy into the dumpster. The key question here is he going to stick to it? The sheer ridiculousness of the table of tariffs that he announced yesterday is kind of hard to take. The case was that there's going to be reciprocity on tariffs. We're just going to charge the same tariffs that people charge to us. Or at least that was, I think, the general understanding of what reciprocity was going to mean. But what he's apparently done was they took the trade deficits of every individual country with the United States and, or rather trade surpluses for each of those countries, deficits for the United States, and then divided them by some number to come up with these absurd percentages. It's even more clownish and disruptive than the worst imaginings of folks. It's shocking how absurd this is, really. But it is where we are. And I think the really key question is, how long does he stick with it? Is he crazy enough to try and just do this going forward? Yup. Will he be able to stand up to the whole Republican Party, everybody in his cabinet who is against it, and a falling stock market? Unknown. We shall see. Dude's 78 years old. He's wanted to do this since the 1980s. Now he's living his dream. I think that's sort of something that Trump and Musk both have in common, is they are both living their impossible dreams and aren't as happy about it as they wanted to be. So Trump's gotten pretty far in life by stubbornly denying reality. He could continue to do that. And yeah, this would really screw over the United States, inflation and whatnot. It would really devastate the world economy, and would turn a lot of folks who became winners through reliant on U.S. trade into losers. Not least China itself. I think there's been some, this is the end of the U.S. model, stuff, which is a little bit premature. This is damaging to the United States for sure, but as with most things, it's more damaging to everybody else. It's a big mess. Malta says, sorry for ranting a bit before that, which he was not, but, being very polite. I'm just frustrated with chunks of the German press talking about Le Pen well, it's legally right, but is it politically smart? Which is a stupid question. I don't know. As someone who's, went to law school, is still technically an attorney, I think it's really important to think harder about what's politically smart, or even, legally smart rather than legally right, because I have less belief in legally right than I used to. But perhaps that's terribly middle-aged and cynical. Joseph Parent says, thank you for answering my Georgia question. You are right. Georgian government is still very pro-Russia, much to the dismay of the Georgians. Hemp Hunter, when do you think the tech bubble will burst? In the next 4 years? Well, I think it could burst this week, but that's kind of crazy, right? If you, let's see where it is. I haven't checked in for an hour, but you might have noticed that while the S&P 500 is in terrible shape, down 4%, crude oil prices today are down 7%. Look, the S&P 500 being down 4% is cataclysmic. We're talking, trillions of dollars of value wiped away, people being, just losing an extraordinary amount of wealth. But that's, 4% today, and tomorrow it could go up 2%, and a month but 7% is a very big one-day drop. And that it's not just the Trump tariffs. I think perhaps intelligently, OPEC decided to bring forward a bunch of production increases that they've been delaying for literally 4 or 5 years. I think reckoning that it'd be better to have one big down day instead of a big down day, and then another huge down day when they announced that. But yeah, crude oil prices are plummeting. And I think there's a good chance that the S&P 500 will bounce back tomorrow, but not anywhere near as good a chance that these oil prices will bounce back tomorrow. To be clear, both are going to bounce back, but maybe, S&P down 4, up 3, crude oil prices down 7, up 2. That's not so hot. So conceivably, because of these tariffs, if these tariffs stay in place, it's not so much the effect for the actual oil business and tariffs, though I think a lot of oil and gas has been exempted from these tariffs. It's way too early to say what the execution would lead to, but it is not too soon to say that if these tariffs persist, we will absolutely see inflation. We will absolutely see a massive slowdown in economic activity everywhere. We will see less trade, which uses oil and gas. We will see less manufacturing in other countries, which uses oil and gas. Manufacturing, industry more broadly, is one of the highest uses of energy. There's a reason why oil prices are down 7% today. If these tariffs persist, and I am getting to the tech here, if these tariffs persist, then we could get to sustained massive drops in oil and gas. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, the oil and gas prices are going under $70 a barrel. What if 2 weeks from now they're at $50 a barrel? And then Saudi Arabia starts having to sell stuff, starts having to sell a lot of stuff. And Saudi Arabia is, as I've pointed out over and over again, most recently in a video on Sunday, the sort of big tech is our greatest threat. I talk a lot about Saudi investing and the way that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been really important in keeping the tech bubble inflated, I would argue probably for a decade longer than it should have been. If these tariffs create a massive oil crash that creates if not a complete dissolution of the Saudi system, a Saudi necessity to start cashing out of a lot of these not so liquid tech investments, then yeah, I could see the tech bubble popping now. Jesus, where's Apple today? I think that was the worst. Which is also, I own a lot of Apple stock. Yeah, Apple's down 9% today. Yeah, it's entirely possible we may be seeing the end of the tech bubble, the amazing U.S. stock market crash, and the end of the More Freedom Foundation, because I'm going to have to go get a job or something. Apple down almost 10% today. That's something. Wow. Okay. Maybe I need a roommate. Yeah. If anybody wants to do a super chat or sign up on Patreon, I'd be super grateful, because the stock market that's kept this this cultural project going for a number of years is not looking so healthy. Wow. Azar Bestoon says, I can't believe how much of Peter Zeihan's fantasies are coming true. You know what? I will go ahead and concede, Azar Bestoon, that this is a better looking day for Peter Zeihan fantasies than most. However, Peter Zeihan's fantasies, with the exception of a sentence here and there, are that the United States is going to withdraw from the world. That's not what's happening here. The United States is using what we're seeing here is the United States using its power in the world trading system for extortion, for a kind of piracy here. This does not look to me like a U.S. empire withdrawing. This looks to me like a U.S. empire consolidating. I'd refer you to Trump and the Real Thucydides Trap podcast that I did recently that talks about this in more detail. So our only chance for the world economy not entering a tailspin is for Trump to go, LOL, get pranked, bro. The camera's right there in a few days. I'd say so. Yeah, actually. Yeah, looks that way. Jesus, 10% down, Apple. That's. I'm used to Tesla gyrating. Tesla being down 5%. That's just a normal day. But Apple being down 8%. That's quite extraordinary. Wow. Yeah. So Apple hasn't been this low, well, since June of 2024. So yeah, it's still pretty inflated. And I definitely bought all my Apple before that. But yeah, it's quite a day that Donald Trump has chosen to give us. And I'm not opposed to tariffs, actually. I haven't done the research that I would like to on it. I have gotten to the point where I think most economists talking about how it's automatic end of everything tariffs. What I do know is that if you want to have tariffs that create meaningful positive change or meaningful change of any kind, they need to be sustained like over the course of years, not week by week, month by month. Here's an absurd rollout. We're going to negotiate over it. Oh, I don't know. It makes zero sense to me, and I think to anybody else. Halbrag says, yes, it's like when the North Koreans do something crazy as a negotiating tactic. Yeah. The United States should be able to rely on its extraordinary power to sort of do everything it wants, but instead we've spent 20, 30 years talking about how governments can't do anything and complaining about all the international organizations that we set up, and now we're just going crazy. Yusuf asks, is war with Iran inevitable, or do you think Israel will change its priority from fighting Iran to fighting Turkey for control of Syria? That's a great question. Is war with Iran inevitable? I don't know. People have been trying really, really hard to create, Israel specifically, a lot of defense contractors and related folks in Washington, D.C. have been trying really, really hard to start this war with Iran. The fact that the Saudis and the Qataris no longer want a U.S. war with Iran is a big deal. The fact that Iran supposedly threatening militias have been utterly destroyed is a really big deal. So, yeah, I think that, Orlok's piece says, Orlok, I like that. Iran wars seem on the loom. Gulf seems to be preparing for retaliation. Europe on the edge. Yeah, we've been here before. And yes, like, this is the greatest threat to U.S. empire. This would be an insane thing to do and to have happen for the United States to go to war with Iran would be an extraordinary, idiotic mistake. But the yeah, that'd be a really, really bad thing to do, and it's really possible. And there are people in the Trump administration who really want it to happen. But there are people in the Trump administration who really don't want it to happen. And I think Donald Trump himself realizes that doing another $1 trillion Middle East war is not in our service. And Saudi Arabia has finally realized that such a war would utterly destroy Saudi Arabia. Iran convinced them of that in 2019 by destroying some Saudi oil resources. So what? Iran war is a total risk. It is not inevitable. Is Israel going to focus on competition with Turkey and now Egypt on its borders again? I don't know. That's a really interesting question. Obviously, Turkey is vastly more threatening to Israel than Iran is. I think that Turkey is nowhere near the point it would want to be at to legitimately threaten Israel's position in Lebanon, Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights. However, Israel keeps pushing into the territory of Syria, Turkey's client state. And Turkey is a huge barrier to Israel's further expansion into Syria. I do think that even the Biden administration, maybe not the Biden administration, but certainly the Obama administration or the Bush administration or the Clinton administration or the first Bush administration would have stopped Israel from occupying the fucking suburbs of Damascus the way that it seems to be trying to do right now. But yeah, the Trump administration hasn't. So yeah, I think that's a real risk for Turkey. That's a real risk for Israel because Turkey is significant enough militarily that like a real conflict, obviously, not obviously, but I think very likely that Turkey, if it acted quickly, could smash Israel like a bug. But the United States would then probably go to war with Turkey, which is a really horrible thing to contemplate. So yeah, that is a new grim risk, and it's entirely possible that we'll be looking nostalgically back at the prospect of Iran-Turkey conflict, while Iran has sort of moved off and forgotten about Israel entirely, while Turkey and Israel are blocked in a new decades-long, more serious conflict. That's kind of terrifying, but a very real possibility. Eternal M says, does the USA still need a secure Strait of Hormuz in the event of an Iran war, or should I buy a horse? You should buy a horse. If the United States and Iran get into a war, nothing is making it through the Strait of Hormuz, certainly not oil or gas. I mean, that depends on like the level of escalation. I think Iran, it is a gamble that Trump would make. Trump could gamble that maybe I can bomb the nuclear sites and bomb some other stuff in Iran if I do it real quick, once and then back down. Maybe that'll happen. I mean, that's horrifically, that's what happened in his first administration. He murdered one of the most powerful people in Iran, also a guy who was really instrumental to defeating the Islamic State, and then Iran sent sort of like an ineffectual retaliation, and it sort of ended there. And maybe Trump thinks he can bomb some nuclear sites, and then there'll be some ineffectual retaliation. It can end there. He could not necessarily even be wrong about that, but goddamn, would that be a risky, stupid thing to do? So, yeah. What's to say? By the way, can Congress or Senate stop tariffs? I think I saw something saying that that would require like a 2/3 majority of both houses, which you're obviously not going to get with Republicans in it. So yeah, the best hope is to vote out all the Republicans in 2026. Pretty much it's just going to be nonsense time until then. Mo Freedom Foundation, if the tariffs go through and Trump just hands half of Ukraine to Russia and lets Taiwan get taken, will that be China taking over the U.S.'s place as hegemon? Hell no! That'll be the United States liberated from a bunch of useless bullshit. That'll be U.S. empire finally set free. I think that'd be like the next phase of... I think if all that happened, it would be humbling to some really stupid people and would provide a great opportunity to the United States. I mean, let's remember that the launch of the most intense period of British hegemony was essentially the loss of the U.S., the loss of the United States in 1770s. Obviously, there was a big war with France that had to be won, but the biggest The most intense period of U.S. empire thus far was launched after World War II with the United States giving up the Philippines, which had been U.S. territory for 50 years up to that point. I think shedding these problem areas that were designed by the United States to cause problems would be a tremendous liberation for the United States. To be clear, I do think the Taiwan thing, I think what Trump sort of signifies is like just how silly it is to talk about defending Taiwan anymore, especially considering that display with Zelensky in the Oval Office. Like, it's just that's over. The Taiwan thing, I think, is pretty over. I think we're not abandoning Ukraine. And I guess I don't want to abandon Ukraine, and I don't think we are going to. So as liberating as it would be for the United States to ditch Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, I don't actually anticipate that happening. And even with Taiwan, I think that if, as the Trump administration seems to be doing, just shuts the fuck up about it, we have another 20 years of sort of profitably will we or won't weing over Taiwan, even though I think the answer is pretty conclusively we won't. If Turks actually establish airfields manned by Turkish personnel in Syria along the Turkish border, but not committing any strikes against Israel, would Israel attack those bases? That is a question we are learning the answer to right now. Where is the T4 airfield? The TS airbase is where? So basically, it's not on the border. There's been an announcement, I think, that the Turkish government is now attempting to occupy. Turkey began its effort to take control of Syria's TS airbase. This is in the center of Syria. This is the largest airbase in the country. This is the airbase that I assume Assad and Russia was using heavily. And it's T4, and Turkey is preparing to deploy air defense systems around TS airbase, and Israel is bombing it. So that is an active question this week. The T4 airbase, the TS airbase in the center of Syria, Turkey is in the process of attempting to occupy and fortify that while Israel is bombing it. It's a really interesting story that we should all be paying more attention to. I think we're already in that case, not on the border, not along the Turkish border, Thanatos, but in the center of Syria. Turkey is attempting to set up an airbase, and Israel is bombing it. I don't know what the status of deconfliction is. I am sure that there are a lot of people in the Pentagon right now going, what the fuck? This is a really big deal. We really need a president or a high-level diplomat to weigh in on this. And Trump's doing psycho tariffs, and his high-level diplomats are trying to figure out how to work their cell phones. That's a great question, Thanatos. That's actually kind of what might actually happen. James Parker, I would disagree that the loss of the United States was actually a pretty big blow to the British Empire. I think it was kind of awesome for the British Empire. The British Empire was able to profit mightily from the expansion of the United States and not have to, was able to make all the money off of the slaves and the produce, but was not obligated to fortify that massive border or deal with the politics of indigenous tribes and rapacious settlers. So I think actually it's one of those weird things when you are the world hegemon, as the United States is. Losses aren't necessarily losses. They can just be sort of fortuitous. They can be you're cutting your losses, and you can actually free up resources for other projects. Rob, do you see the USA political culture trying to solidify itself through things like English and Christianity becoming official language and religion? Well, Christianity's dead. And like, what's that classic? I can't remember who said it. Well, there's the classic Chesterton quote. It's like people who stop believing in God, and I don't know. I think he was talking about a Christian God. Will believe in anything. And then a more recent quote, I can't remember who said, is like, well, if you don't like the religious right, wait till you see the post-religious right. I think a really underappreciated dynamic in the evisceration of foreign aid under Donald Trump, the end of USAID, is the death of Christianity in the United States. There was, when these programs were launched half a century ago, there was still enough legitimate Christian feeling that people across the political spectrum, might not. I mean, I don't think right-wing people have ever been super psyched about foreign aid, but there were enough people. And honestly, I mean, a lot of the nonprofits that USAID works through are still organizations like Caritas, the Catholic Charities, are still very Christian organizations. And just to gleefully just eviscerate these charitable organizations is a very anti-Christian thing to do. So yeah, I don't think there's any question of like a establishment of religion. There's, oh shit, what happened? Oh no. Are we gone? That's strange. Huh. Well, that stinks. Are we still on? Let me know if we are still here. Are we still going? That was quite something. I wonder, man, I hope we didn't lose everything. Now, it says I'm still going. Hopefully that was just a brief blip. But yeah, so establishing Christianity is simply not going to happen. That is, we would have to throw out the U.S. Constitution to establish a religion. And also, Christianity is pretty dead in the United States anyway. A lot of people, are culturally Christian, but it's not something that exists anymore. And that's not true. I think I know dedicated Christians. I know churches that are still somewhat vibrant, but it's a dying thing. The establishment of the English language really isn't necessary. The establishment of the English language is happening everywhere, regardless, and not just in the United States. I think that the crusade against wokeness, which is becoming a crusade against, basic civil rights, is also, just as a side effect, a crusade against, Spanish language everything. But also, Spanish language everything isn't really that important anymore. Certainly, there's been a large influx of refugees and what have you, but that's in the context of, the tens of millions of immigrants over the past 30 or 40 years. All their kids speak English, and very few of their grandkids speak Spanish. It's just not the idea that English was ever threatened, it just doesn't come up much in U.S. politics anymore because it was always ridiculous. But in the age of cable television and the internet, English just very quickly becomes omnipresent. You can certainly find workers who don't speak English still, but it's not. It's nowhere near as dominant as it was, say, in the 1880s or the 1890s. Or was it famously in the Midwest? Most Lutheran churches still preached in German up until World War I or what have you. So no, I don't see any chance of English or Christianity becoming the official language or religion. But English is just it's the baseline in the United States. That's not going to change while there's a United States. And I think that despite the recent influx because of Trump's sanctions on Venezuela and just general COVID dislocations, I think it's kind of the last gasp of Spanish language migration to the United States. It's not that there won't continue to be migration to the United States, but it's going to be more Africa and Asia. And I don't think there's never going to be as massive an influx of one language into the United States again. Or I mean, who knows? Anything can happen, but I don't anticipate that happening in our current, this current iteration of human being, having a massive influx from just one country that speaks one different language that presents enough of of a threat to English language, and it was never much of a threat to English language dominance in the United States. Target, Reconquista was supposed to make U.S. Christian again. That didn't happen. Yeah, obviously. Chuck, what's very interesting about Spanish-speaking migration to the United States is just how defeated the Catholic Church is by that migration process, which is also a real testament to the power of U.S. assimilation. Is most Latin, my understanding is that most Latin immigrants stay very strongly religious and strongly Christian in the United States, but a shockingly large percentage of them switch from Catholicism, the historic religion of Spanish America, to sort of hardcore Protestant evangelical prosperity gospel stuff that is, very, very North American, very United States type Christian ideologies. So yeah, the immigrants from Latin America don't hold on to Spanish as adamantly as folks had expected. Certainly not their kids and grandkids, but they don't even hold on to their Catholic religion, which is kind of interesting. Thank you, Halbrag. Wow, that's crazy. Chuck says, I worked for 4 years in real estate in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and had a bunch of meetings that the only common language that could be used was English. One of the most striking experiences that I was working as a corporate attorney in Istanbul, Turkey, and I had almost no experience as a lawyer at that point. But I was intermittently very valuable to my law firm because I was the only native English language speaker there. Every corporate attorney at this law firm had to be fluent in English. There was like a litigation side of the law firm that, some of the folks didn't speak English there because they were working in Turkish courts primarily. But everybody who was looking at contracts, doing transactions, had to speak English in Istanbul, Turkey. And the fact that I spoke English as a native language made me tremendously valuable to them every now and then. And it was crazy realizing that probably, maybe some parts in rural Germany you can do corporate business, maybe in the heart of the Mittelstand or whatever, you can do business in German. And I'm certain to the extent that there are Chinese attorneys, I know there are Chinese attorneys, it's sort of a different set of parameters for Chinese law than there are in the United States or elsewhere. And I'm sure in China you can be a functioning attorney without any English language knowledge, but I think that's probably about it. If you're doing corporate law anywhere in the world, you have to speak English. If you're doing business anywhere in the world, it really, I don't know if it's quite as required, but it's very helpful to know English. So yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's crazy. So yeah, because Malta talking about Merkel was a scientist in East Germany, right, before she moved into politics. Malta is reading the Angela Merkel autobiography that became the Chancellor of Germany. English was also the most common language for scientific gatherings in the Eastern Alliance, which is crazy. So in the Warsaw Pact, already English was what's crazy is that the British kicked themselves out of the European Union, but I still understand that English is still a very important language, if not officially, is sort of de facto still a very important language of business in the European Union. Would Trump alienate the U.S. from its allies, and how? Trump absolutely is in the process of alienating the United States from its allies, but I don't know, maybe Malta would say something different, but I do think that the extent to which, the U.S. has lost Germany forever, I think that sort of overstates things. Even if, and as I've said multiple times, I'll believe when the U.S.-European relationship is truly broken, when the United States gets kicked out of Ramstein and a variety of military bases we maintain in Germany and Italy. But, even if Trump has permanently broken something about the Atlantic Alliance, whoever the next president is, Republican or Democratic, it's not like they're going to be, barred from diplomatic connections with Europe, and it's not like Europe and the United States won't have some commonalities that they'll be able to bond on the future. I think that certainly Donald Trump is an extraordinarily damaging figure. I mean, look what he's doing to the stock market, and is tremendously damaging to the Atlantic Alliance or what have you. But so was Bush. So was Reagan, actually. It's just something that's not recalled. You had massive. I think obviously there are a lot of very good reasons why there was a huge nuclear freeze movement. There should be a huge nuclear freeze movement now. There should always be a huge nuclear freeze movement, a huge movement against nuclear weapons everywhere. But one of the main reasons why it was so incredibly powerful in Europe and in the United States in the 1980s was because everybody was freaked out and terrified by Ronald Reagan. So, yes, Trump, time passes, things are different. Where European and U.S. power is different. China and India being factors. Everything's different. But this is not the first time in U.S. history or the history of the transatlantic relationship where a U.S. president has come in and broken a lot of stuff. In fact, it's just been part of the relationship. What would you need to see to confirm that China was truly becoming the next hegemon? The world speaking Chinese. I think I've made it pretty clear. I don't believe that China will ever be the next hegemon. I don't think that next hegemon is a role that's open, really, until we start talking about differing levels of technological advancement, differing approaches. I think that the United States had reached a level of stability in the world system that I think had the potential to be perpetual. Not perpetual, nothing is perpetual, but had the potential, and I think still has the potential to last for centuries. It is a weird new thing to have the world knit together. No matter how high the tariffs are that Donald Trump instantiates, he's not going to, and I think this is part of the Zion analysis that I think he misses. He's not going to evaporate the internet. He's not going to evaporate worldwide shipping entirely. He's not going to go to all these countries and strip the ability to read and write away from their populations. He's not going to strip away broadly spread ideas of nationalism and technological accomplishment that are present everywhere in the world now. He's not going to strip away basic ideas. He's trying, but he's not going to be able to strip away basic ideas of justice and international governance that have been internalized by most of the world at this point. The idea that China is going to come in and be the hegemon would require that role being needed to be filled. I think that the United States can certainly get to a point where it is ignored, is pushed out of the reserve currency status that it currently has, a number of other things. But I do not believe that China specifically would be able to take over the world to the extent that the United States has run things. I don't see it. I think there's a lot of, Britain was sort of the first mover in advantage and was able to act truly horrifically to everybody and get away with it for a century. The United States is horrific to individual countries, despite being vastly more powerful than the British Empire ever was, because the world has changed. And the world has changed over the course of American hegemony. And there just isn't the space for, the third mover on controlling a world system to necessarily even exist. M. Mahdi says, the next hegemon would be on Mars, led by eternal God Emperor Elon Musk. I mean, who knows, man? If he gets out of this fix, maybe that's the case. I still can't understand how China, with 4 times the population, can't match the United States. So the United States has military bases all over the world. China has 2. The reason the United States has military bases all over the world is history, because things were set up such that the United States managed to be the big winner in a catastrophic war. If the United States is stupid enough to create a larger catastrophic war on the nature of a World War I or a World War II, then if humanity survives, then maybe there would be scope for China to set up. But if there was such a World War III, I think China's big population centers are getting nuked anyway. And, even if the United States loses. So, I just don't. It would take World War III. That I guess answers Loga's question. It would take World War III for the United States to be replaced as a hegemon. There's too much in the way the world works. Dollar reserve currency, international systems, international institutions, that is U.S. centric and U.S. focused. Just sort of the way it is. Malta, I've been doing top chat instead of live chat the whole time. I've screwed up. Malta asks, why does YouTube keep eating my comments? I don't know. Was there a keyword you're using that they don't like? Skipto says, Trump tard. Any other Trump tards in the chat? Are there any other Trump tards in the chat? I mean, Skipto, are you really still a Trump tard after all this nonsense? Thanatos says, I just lost the feed completely and had to refresh the page to continue watching, but it's just my router. I had that experience, surprisingly, and it worked. I hope it actually is continuing to record. Maybe someone should avoid the British Empire. That'd be great as our best tune. That'd be great. I haven't looked into this. That does sound very interesting. The general says, what do you think about the YouTuber turned EU member of parliament, Phidias? It's really interesting what he's trying to do with transparency. That sounds fascinating. Yeah, Malta says, we'll try again. Germany won't intentionally break with the United States and kick the United States out, except something really funny happens. Yeah, I think it would take a lot more. Could we see financial crash under Trump after all deregulation and after AI bubble burst? Are we seeing a Fireblade? We could be seeing a financial crash right now. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Who knows? Tomorrow, all this stuff could bounce back. It's things are not looking great right now. No, oil's bouncing back a little bit. It's only down 6% today. Extraordinary. Hard to say. Well, we are coming to the end of this public live stream. Thank you all for showing up and participating in what may perhaps have not been the most scintillating of topics. I think what's happening to the Kurds right now is fascinating and well worth paying attention to. I'm grateful that I got to spend a couple weeks for this, reading a comprehensive history of modern Kurdistan, which I had not had the opportunity to do much. We do yet. We've, if you're interested, a part one of sort of our take on Kurdish history is out already, and there will be a part two coming up in the coming weeks with some Trumpy candy in between, because people don't seem to want to watch podcasts on Kurdish history either. But anyway, tremendously grateful for everybody who was here. It's a tremendous privilege to be able to discuss the issues of the world with all of you. Very grateful. My name is Robert Morris. I'm on TikTok and Instagram and Blue Sky now as the More Freedom Foundation. My YouTube channel is, of course, the Mo Freedom Foundation. There's a character limit, apparently, or at least there was when I established my channel quite some time ago. So that is. That's what's up. I have Twitter, Rob Law. I wrote a book called Avoiding the British Empire that talks about a lot of these topics. I have a Patreon, especially with the stock market crashing. It'd be great if more of you signed up on my Patreon. Loga, I think the I hadn't actually mentioned it to Loga yet, but Loga, can we do the Discord patrons only Discord chat on Sunday at noon Eastern Standard Time? Would you be down for that, Loga? You can only access that discussion by signing up on Patreon. Madi says, "Have a nice life, Rob." Jeez, that's very conclusive, Madi. Hope you're not going anywhere. The general asks, "Can you do a video on India?" The real challenge is that. To do a video on India, I would have to read dozens of books on India, and I've probably only read a dozen books on India. I should do more videos on India for sure. But yeah. So yeah, apparently I think we Gucci, says Loga. I think that means that we will be doing the Discord patrons only chat on Sunday at noon. So there's an incentive to sign up for Patreon if you haven't yet. And basically, I guess, thank you. I guess we've got 4 more minutes. If people start throwing super chats at me, I will go beyond the 2 p.m. limit, of course. Yeah. You should mention the earthquake on Southeast Asia from earlier this week. I did see some horrific imagery from earthquake, specifically hit Myanmar, correct? Yeah, earthquakes are horrible. I don't know much more to say about that. I don't know how that impacts various machinations around Myanmar, the ongoing conflict there. But yeah, should probably pay a little more attention to that. Malta says the biggest U.S. military hospital outside the United States is in Germany, the only one with a trauma treatment facility, and they're building a new biggest one right now. Yeah, is that Ramstein or is that somewhere else, Malta? I recall one of the very slim silver linings of the Iraq War was actually sort of revolutionary improvements in trauma medicine. The body count, the actual number of U.S. soldiers that died in the Iraq War was tiny compared to Vietnam. It was absolutely a smaller war than Vietnam. But the fact that both U.S. soldiers, U.S. medical teams, and the doctors associated, I think specifically including that journey in specifically that hospital in Germany had a lot to do with dramatically reducing the mortality, saving the lives of a lot of people who were really nastily injured in Iraq and Afghanistan. Skipto says, Rob, I can help you on Kurdistan. I was stationed there to help fight ISIS. Well, regrettably, Skipto, this is the third and fourth hour of Kurdistan coverage that I have done recently with the intention to not cover Kurdistan again anytime soon. But Skipto, I'll keep that in mind if something horrible happens in Kurdistan. So hopefully, for the benefit of the Kurds, Skipto, I'll never need to call on you. What are some books that would you recommend on India? I am a Modi fan. What have I read recently? I just read these long survey books and I learn a little bit. I can't say that I've... There was a really actually an interesting one I read a couple years back that just sort of did Indian history in multiple personalities over 6,000 years, which is just a really useful way to do it because it's just such a vast history. And that was a good starting point. What did I read recently? Did I read a whole history of the subcontinent? I can't... Sorry, I'm completely... Skipto says, I can help you with Kurdistan content. Well, I appreciate that, Skipto, but as I just said, if I have to call on you to do more Kurdistan content, that means that something has gone horribly wrong in Kurdistan. So hopefully that is not a thing that will happen. I feel like Kurdistan and Baluchistan would have really benefited if they had their own countries. Sure, I mean, yeah. But I think that... I think it's a little late to be setting up countries, is sort of my approach generally. There's an Indian American who makes videos about contemporary Indian politics. I think his name is The Emissary. Interesting. I do learn sometimes from other people's YouTube videos and such, but I tend to read books. That's sort of how I wanted to do multiple hours of Kurdistan content, so I read a 600-page book. And I found that to be very helpful. Skipto, thank you so much for the super chat on Kurdistan content. And thank you all for being here. This has been another lovely afternoon, and I remain tremendously grateful that folks are that's interesting. Targets. Darfur did not receive its independence. South Sudan did, and it's still probably better off than it was, and so is East Timor. So even though I am not generally a pro-independence, chopping up countries kind of guy, I don't think it's entirely accurate to say, Target, that Darfur and East Timor received their independence and they're both worse off now. I don't know that that's true. But anyway, thank you all so very much. This has been awesome, and have a great time. We're ending the stream. End the stream. Dismiss.